everyone. My name is Janet Mangia. Welcome. And with me today, I have Matt Cossey. And we're going to be talking to you about something a little different. We're going to be talking about boarding passes. And I know that sounds a little bit odd, but if you can please bear with us, hopefully it'll all make sense towards the end. When we're looking at the boarding pass, Matt, what is it about the boarding pass that we need to pay attention to?
Well, there's an awful lot actually contained on that little slip of paper, or sometimes on your mobile phone now. But let's just start with the name. So we've got Jane Doe on a boarding pass. That's a very common name,
Right.
and I'm sure there's more than one Jane Doe taking a flight. So this is our customer, and their name likely resides in the airline's customer data management solution, perhaps in their CRM system. But if we dig deeper into that profile, what do we know about this customer? Are they a frequent flyer? How often do they travel with us? What's their loyalty status? Does that loyalty status grant them extra facilities? And then we want to use that information in the back office to provide excellent customer experiences, travel experiences. So, do we know that they, always like an aisle seat or a window seat or this kind of pillow or what drinks or meal service they provide? And we can start to prepare for that customer coming on board before they've even joined and knowing what they're likely to prefer. So all of these preferences can start to come together, and all of this is captured in that airline system. But there's a lot more on that boarding pass than just a customer name.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot already. But so elaborate a little bit. What else can we, look at a boarding pass, and what else can it do for the total experience for that customer?
Sure. Let's talk about what's on that boarding pass. So one of the things is you're going to have the terminal that the passenger needs to get to, the gate that they're departing from, where they need to do check-in, where they've got to do get their baggage to. So we can now use that information to start providing information to the customer when they arrive at the airport. You need to go to X gate. We can integrate that with geolocations and start providing directions and information how to best travel through the airport. I mean, some airports are huge places. I've been lost in some many times before. So there's definitely a connection there to location. And what are the facilities available at location? Maybe you need disabled access. Maybe you just want to be able to get coffee or use the restrooms or whatever. So how do you just make this information all available about the location to a customer through their, maybe their mobile app? It's all powered from knowing exactly what flight did you take. Then that looks in the register, which terminal it's going to be in, which gate. So this is all master data behind the scenes, powering this location information that's ultimately, again, aimed at, obviously, smooth business process, but the kicker is that you can use it to add greater detail for the customer to improve their experience, just to make life easier. And sometimes services might not be available when they're normally expected to be. If you're able to update that information in real time, and then the location data gets pushed out through various channels, and your customer then doesn't go looking for something that they're going to ultimately be disappointed with. You just want to make sure people have got information. So,
when I fly, I look at my boarding pass, and unfortunately, I always see in big letters, economy class. One day,
turn left.
I will be able to turn left. Absolutely right. So what is the difference between, having that economy class on your boarding pass versus being lucky enough to have the first class? How does that influence the overall experience for the customer?
Yeah, well, obviously, they paid a bit more for that ticket to say business class or first class, but then you want to reward that. And so, this isn't, there are obvious things that you get priority boarding that you would expect. But let's look back into our CRM system again. Let's tie this back to the customer profile, what we know about them in context. Because this isn't a person that is just a system of record. You want to understand, who they are, who they may be traveling with. And I sort of alluded to it earlier. What are their preferences? If they are vegetarians, do they want to have a certain meal choice? Do they always like champagne? If you're going up front, what's your loyalty status? Are you a high spending customer? And you want to make sure that you're treating that customer in the way that they would expect, to give them that experience. So just having that on your card is nice to look at.
Yeah.
And you get the normal frills. But, and we've seen this not just with airlines, but, hotels is another great example, that you're able to, for all your staff in the back office, whatever their role, know who their customer is when they board the plane or go in the hotel. And I think I mentioned it earlier, what movies selections are their preference? Do they always look comedies? Do they like a certain kind of pillow or blanket or brand of champagne? And I've never been left either, so I don't know if they give you different brands of champagne. But all these things are managed, and you're doing that with, you're talking about you and your experience. The airline is talking about millions of customers a day.
Absolutely. So something as simple as a boarding pass, actually, when you look at all those data points together, there's a lot of connecting systems that have to work in perfect synergy to make that experience come to life. And, I think that's what master data is all about, right?
Well, you picked up on an interesting word there, connecting. And, over my years working in data management, there's one phrase amongst many that stuck out with me, which was our customers said, we're able to integrate data, we're able to migrate data, we're able to move data around with ETL and all these kinds of things. But he said, I can't connect it. And what he meant by that is not just the notion of moving stuff together, but how do you actually create data points between different sets of data? Because that's the real kicker, where you get this additional insight from being able to find a combination of a certain customer at a certain location, using or having a preference for certain types of products. And this nexus of data, once connected, is truly enlightening. You can understand things that were never obvious really before. So on that board, going back to that boarding pass, there's a lot of master data that sits behind the customer, the product, i.e. which flight they're taking and which class they're in, and the flight times and the gates and the location information. And then behind that, the meal service needs to come from certain suppliers. So we've got certain special requests for meals. Then we need to connect that to who's our suppliers for the catering service on board the flight. The boarding card is just a sort of consolidation of this huge amount of work that's going on in the background to make sure that the flight runs smoothly, but you have a good experience whilst you're there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, thank you very much for sharing that, Matt. I think that concludes our podcast for today. Do you want to close this out here?
Yeah. So thank you for staying with us. And next time you're holding your boarding pass, remember it's not just a piece of paper. It's the result of well-organized data working together, so behind the scenes, to make that travel experience smoother. That's all for today. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks for watching. If you want more content like this, subscribe to the Stibo Systems YouTube channel.